first, I want to welcome y'all to Manage and Overcome Fatigue and Other Side Effects. This session will be recorded. I want to introduce Dr. Noël Arring, and she, I skipped, sorry. Dr. Arring is an associate professor at the University of Tennessee College of Nursing. She's been a nurse leader for over 15 years, including positions at the Mayo Clinic, leading nursing research, evidence-based practice, and co-leading the development of the Cancer Survivorship Program in Arizona. She's a principal investigator in the UT Cancer Symposium Science Intervention Research Team, where her work focuses on developing interventions for cancer-related symptoms like fatigue, hot flashes, and sexual health. I do want to let you guys know that after this session, there will be a break, and we will have time for questions. So when she's done presenting, please feel free to line up at the microphone and ask any questions. Dr. Arring?
Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me. I have to thank the organizing group that brought me here, and I'm very excited to share with this my presentation on fatigue. So before I get started, though, I kind of want to explain how I ended up here today. Because if you would have asked me, I've been an oncology nurse for over 20 years, and if you would have asked me when I started if I would be talking about research, evidence-based practice, all of these things to groups of people, I would have been like, absolutely not, right? So I actually started my journey, like she had mentioned, at the Mayo Clinic as a nurse at the bedside, primarily delivering care to patients who needed blood and marrow transplants, but we also took care of a wide variety of oncology patients. One of the things that happened, so keep in mind this was 20 plus years ago, we were seeing patients who were coming into the hospital with symptoms that were, I knew, related to their cancer treatment. But because they had been a year, 2 years post their treatment, they weren't being taken care of by the oncology providers. So as a nurse, I had to speak up loudly and say, I think this is related to their cancer treatment, and then sort of help get that care. But what I realized is that there was this whole gap, right? This gap between the treatment ended and then you were ostensibly being taken care of by your primary care providers, but there wasn't a lot of resources for anybody, including the clinicians involved. So I actually went back to school while I was still a staff nurse to get my doctorate in nursing practice focused on the population health management of cancer survivors. And I can tell you at that time it was kind of, I will say, cutting edge, because we weren't really thinking of cancer as a chronic disease. And we now know that that's essentially what it is for the majority of people. So that work actually was the foundation for the Mayo Clinic Cancer Survivorship Program, and I specifically led the co-development of the survivorship program in Arizona, which is awesome. And so part of what we tried to do is we put together survivorship care plans. And how many of you, just so I know who I'm speaking to, how many of you are cancer survivors? Excellent. And how many of you are pre-vivors? Okay, which is a new term for me, which I'll explain in a minute. And then there are so many other people, but I think that was everybody raise their hand. If I missed you, please tell me what you're... Yay! Clinician, I love it. So one of the things that happened is we were putting together these survivorship care plans. And as a nurse, I love care planning, right? That's part of what they trained me to do. But I found out that I was looking for the things. We'd done a lot of work with patients and families around what needed to be done for survivorship. That actually is the majority of what my DNP was focused on. And we heard loud and clear it was things like fatigue, sexual health, all of these things. So I was putting together care plans with these, what do you do for the long-term side effects of fatigue? Well, I'm going to tell you 20 years ago, I had absolutely nothing to tell anybody. There was a big fat donut in terms of evidence-based recommendations around cancer-related fatigue. Now, sexual health, I could do a little bit for some of the men with like erectile dysfunction, but almost nothing for women for sexual health. So I actually went back to school and got my PhD focused on developing interventions to help cancer survivors manage their long-term symptoms. My work actually goes throughout the cancer journey now, but for the most part, what I'm going to talk about is really that post-treatment cancer survivor work. But that's how I got here today. It really was on because of the needs I heard from the patients that I was working with, and honored to be on their cancer journey. disclosures, which I think is very important. So first and foremost, the Ginseng Board of Wisconsin, which is a nonprofit organization that represents all the Wisconsin ginseng growers. So this is actually very similar to the Ocean Spray Group. I don't know if you guys know about how cranberries are grown. There is a coalition. That's essentially what the Ginseng Board of Wisconsin is. They have supplied ginseng and the matching placebos for our investigated-initiated ginseng clinical trials. What that really means is I developed the trial, and then I went and asked them if they would help, and they literally just gave me the ginseng and the placebo for free, and that was the only involvement they had in the studies that I'll talk about today, which is awesome. I will also be discussing the off-label use of ginseng, and that's partly just to clarify what that means. Ginseng is not FDA approved. That's what that means, okay? And it's partly because it's a supplement and they have a little bit different track. We'll talk a little bit about that today too. The other is I definitely want to acknowledge that this presentation is supported by the Breast Cancer Research Foundation. My career for the last 6 years has been supported by the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, and part of what they have me commit to, and I do this with open arms, is make sure that I'm presenting work to patient-facing groups. So this is actually part of their priorities, and I think it's fantastic. So many of you who raise your hand already know this definition. And so one of the awesome things about doing this presentation for FORCE is I actually had to meet with, I don't know what her actual title is, but with people from FORCE to talk about what it is they actually wanted in this presentation, which I absolutely appreciate. One of the key things that they really articulated is that I needed to make my presentation speak to everybody who was planning to attend. So I learned some new words in this process, and pre-vivor was one of them. So as a researcher primarily focused on cancer survivorship, I honestly didn't even realize that this was a term. Now, when I looked it up, I realized now that FORCE actually coined this about a year or so ago. Actually, probably 5 years, I think, 5 years ago, but this definition is from their current definition. And I think it's important for us to understand that, and I'm not going to read this definition. I think many of you are already living this. What I wanted to do, so I'm like, okay, great, pre-vivor, that's awesome. So just like I would do for anything, so I'm a researcher, I wanted to find out more information. So how many pre-vivors are there in the United States? How many of them have fatigue? I had all of these questions, and I can tell you I came up with donuts. There is really very little information around pre-vivors in the United States, and I think partly because it is a relatively new term, there are some previous terms that were used, but I don't know that people have really thought of this group in the cohort context, right? So I think I've talked to a few people last night at the reception. I don't know how many of you went to the lovely reception last night and got to talk to some other researchers, and the research is starting, right? I think probably in another 5 years or so, hopefully we'll know more, because in order to really help address your needs, we need to be able to articulate, right, some of these basic things. So I apologize for not having more stats on this particular group, but I do think a lot of what I'm going to talk about today could absolutely be applied if you do have fatigue. And I'll do some little caveats as we go through. So the majority of my work, especially around fatigue, is really focused on cancer survivors. And just to talk about this definition, the National Cancer Institute defines cancer survivor as an individual from that time of diagnosis through the balance of life. So they have a very broad definition of cancer survivor, and that is, when I say cancer survivor, this is what I mean. And I think that's important, because a lot of times when you're talking to clinicians, they really only think of cancer survivors after treatment is completed. And I don't think that applies to a lot of the men and women that I work with, because some of them actually don't stop treatment, right? There are over 18 million cancer survivors in the United States, and that's from 2022. That number is expected to go up to about 30 million in the next 5 years. That's about 6% of the US population right now. So that's a large percentage of us are considered cancer survivors, and that's an important number to keep in mind as we move through these next few slides. And these are all coming from the National Cancer Institute. I'm sorry, so 22 million in the next 5 years is the actual number. But so here we have also from the National Cancer Institute that 69% of survivors have lived 5 years since diagnosis, which I can tell you from the 20 years I've been in oncology, that's a pretty significant improvement. We have 47% of survivors have lived 10 years since diagnosis. And then we're moving closer to about 20% of survivors will have lived 20 plus years since diagnosis. And the reason why I report these statistics out to you is to understand that as we get better at treatment and diagnosis, this means we have more and more of a population who's actually living with the impacts of cancer and cancer treatment, which makes these sorts of talks about fatigue utterly important, right? Because there are more people impacted by some of the symptoms we're going to talk about today. And I'm probably preaching to the choir, and I realize that, but I think it's important. But before we get started, I actually wanted to talk about possible causes of fatigue. Now, this list actually isn't specific to cancer previvors. This is just in general, what are some possible causes of fatigue? Because I think this is an important place to start. The first are lifestyle factors. We know that drugs and alcohol can actually impact fatigue or actually be a cause of fatigue, depending on how much the use of either of those. Our diets, medicine. So I can tell you I've moved to Tennessee in the last 2 years, and never before in my life have I had to take so many antihistamines. And now I have to take them twice a day during this sort of season in order to just be able to stand up and talk to you. Those medicines we know can cause fatigue, right? Now, for most of those things, after you've taken them for a period of time, that fatigue goes away, but for some it doesn't. We know for a fact that sleep and not sleeping enough is directly related to fatigue, right? So if you have any issues with sleep, specifically insomnia or any of those other things, right, that causes fatigue. The fun thing here is too little physical activity or too much physical activity can cause fatigue, so you really need to figure out that sweet spot and that physical activity. And then we have conditions, and this is literally just a snapshot. There are more potential conditions, and I'm not necessarily going to read all of these, but just to give you sort of an idea. But things like adrenal insufficiency, anemia, anxiety, depression, all of those actually have been potential causes of fatigue. There is a large cohort of people in the United States right now who have long COVID and are suffering from fatigue. So that is definitely, we've seen fatigue or chronic fatigue rise significantly because of the impact of COVID. The other, and I like to point this out, is many people think about hypothyroidism and fatigue, but actually hyperthyroidism has about the same rate of fatigue as hypo. So the other, and you guys look relatively young, but I can speak for myself, menopause could absolutely cause fatigue or be associated with it, and a lot of times we think that's related to the hormones, which we're going to talk about in relationship to cancer and cancer diagnosis and treatment, right? Because there's some hormone impact in a lot of those. So these are a whole bunch of possible causes. But what we're going to focus on today, for the most part, is cancer-related fatigue, and that's a very specific thing. And this is the way the National Comprehensive Cancer Network defines it: as a distressing, persistent, subjective sense of physical, emotional, and/or cognitive tiredness or exhaustion that's related to cancer or cancer treatment, and it's not proportional to recent activity, and it interferes with usual functioning. In general, what we mean by this is if you get a good night's rest, but you're still waking up and you are so tired you cannot do the things that you want to, that would be considered fatigue. And I can tell you in my work, I see this a lot. This is one of the number one symptoms I hear most from people I work with who've had a cancer diagnosis. So, as I just mentioned, fatigue is the most reported cancer-related symptom. And I can tell you it can last years after treatment. I have worked with people who have reported fatigue who are 20 years post their cancer treatment and have had suffered with fatigue for those 20 years. So what does that mean? 99% of people during active cancer treatment report having cancer-related fatigue. And I can tell you that changes a little bit depending on the type of treatment you've had. This is kind of a general. But if you've had radiation, almost 100% of patients who've had radiation treatment report having fatigue. Now, 30% of patients report cancer-related fatigue years after treatment. And I can tell you, I think this estimate is low, but this is the best one I have. So we have about 30% of people who are diagnosed with cancer report having fatigue years after their treatment. Oh, so let me go back to that. That means there's about almost 6 million people who continue to suffer with fatigue. So higher risk. So we know if you've had cancer treatment, and you continue to work, you're at higher risk for fatigue. You have children at home, it also means you're probably at higher risk for fatigue. Any other comorbidities like depression or anxiety increases your risk, because we've already talked about how those are already associated with fatigue. And then certain treatments. So chemotherapy, aromatase inhibitors, immune checkpoint inhibitors, radiation, all of those are higher risk for that long-term cancer-related fatigue. Not to say that I've definitely worked with people who didn't receive any of these treatments and still suffered with cancer-related fatigue, right? So there's a lot of different things. So what causes cancer-related fatigue? This is actually a question I have struggled with for about 20 years. We're going to go through some potential answers, and we'll see how we all feel about that. But the first one we're going to talk about are cancer-related treatments, right? So we know that chemotherapy and actually some of the other therapies can cause anemia. So chemotherapy-induced anemia is definitely a cause for fatigue. If you've ever had your hemoglobin at 7 or even 8, that is fatigue-inducing. I mean, and it's very life-impacting. Things like radiation treatment, like I've already mentioned, but a lot of those immunotherapies coming out right now, their number one side effect is fatigue, and it is severe and significant with the people that I've worked with. Now, for the previvors, hormonal disruption absolutely can cause fatigue, as well as surgery or pharmacoprevention techniques. Many of them are associated with fatigue as well. So what about immune responses? This actually has been one of the main things many of us have thought was one of the causes for cancer-related fatigue. And I can tell you that because there's increased cytokines, and cytokines really are those, we'll say, downstream indicators of that flight or fight response, right? So if you have a lot of what we call cytokines in your bloodstream, it kind of tells me that your system has triggered this inflammatory response. But we think it's likely related to it. However, so far, no large, well-controlled study has really evaluated the effects of general anti-inflammatory agents on fatigue or cytokines. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to find out more on this one. But even more so, and I'm going to get a little technical here, but I promise to walk us all through this. One of the key things that I think actually causes cancer-related fatigue, specifically in our cancer survivors post-treatment, is this hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So this beautiful image is not mine, so that is actually from Lanix, and I can't read the second person's name, but essentially what this shows us here is that, can you see my little cursor? You can't. All right, let me see if I can do this little pointer thing here. So when we experience an environmental stressor, your brain perceives it, right? And that results in the activation of this process. We call this whole thing right here the HPA axis. Well, the hypothalamus, which is this beautiful little thing in our brain, kind of kicks in, and it essentially secretes a hormone, which we call corticotropin-releasing hormone, or for brevity, we're going to call CRH. So the hypothalamus says, hey, I perceived a stressor. It kicks in this hormone, and then the front part of the pituitary gland then says, hey, I see this hormone, and it starts secreting an adrenocorticotropic hormone. We call it ACTH. So that ACTH gets secreted by the pituitary. And then that actually goes to the cortex of the adrenal glands, which then produces the fun thing we call cortisone, or cortisol in humans, in response. So then that secretes cortisol, which goes out into your body. And then cortisol is what generates your stress response. So when people say, oh, I've put on those pounds around my waist, and I think it's because I'm stressed, that you can thank to cortisol, right? That's that whole sort of stress response. And that really what this is a chronic flight or fight, right? So I can tell you that the reason why I think this is one of the potential causes of fatigue is that regulation of cortisol is really important for so many different things, but it can actually, when we dysregulate, and for the majority of people we see with cancer-related fatigue, what it is it's dysregulated on. So it's just chronically on. And we need more research to prove exactly what I'm saying, so this is all sort of like hypothesis, just to put that out there. But one key study put fatigued and non-fatigued breast cancer survivors through a whole bunch of stress tests, right, like different stress batteries in a laboratory setting. The non-fatigued survivors mounted a significant cortisol increase in response to that acute stress, while the fatigue survivors had a very blunted response. Now, that may not make a lot of sense, but what they really found was that those who weren't fatigued had a cortisol response. Those that were fatigued were already in that, so they didn't have an increase. It was still already high. And then there was another study that showed that fatigued breast cancer survivors had what we call flattened cortisol slopes. So the beauty of cortisol is it actually fluctuates up and down, and a lot of it goes with our circadian rhythms, right? So what you want are these nice little slopes. For breast cancer survivors who were fatigued, that slope was just flat and it was high. So that tells us that this HPA axis isn't quite working right. So that is why I think this is definitely this dysregulation may account for that prolonged fatigue in many cancer survivors. But just to be clear, what causes cancer-related fatigue, except for chemotherapy-induced anemia, the mechanisms responsible for fatigue in people with cancer, we actually do not know for sure. And I'll be really clear, I actually, for many of the people that I work with, I don't think it's just one thing. I have a feeling it is multiple things, right? There are all these different potential aspects that could trigger a fatigue response. So our group is actually looking at gene expressions. So what genes are turned on or not turned on in fatigued and non-fatigued people. And then what does the response to treatment look like? So that's an area we're moving into, and hopefully that'll give us a little bit more understanding of the actual mechanisms, the reason why people get fatigued, and then that'll help us intervene even better, or more specifically, right? So what are some of the factors contributed to cancer-related fatigue? And we've already talked about a few of these, but the cancer itself. So for many of us, the we now are understanding that tumor cells and tumors, cancer, for the most part, has its own microenvironment. Those environments can actually impact the fatigue response. The effects of cancer treatment, which we've already talked about, things like radiation. One of the nice things about what's happening with radiation over time is we've gotten to be able to be more precise. That's actually helped a lot with some of the fatigue response we've seen. I think we could still improve that as we move forward. And then the physical and psychological comorbidities, which we talked about, things like anxiety and depression. Other symptoms. So if you don't have your symptoms managed, the likelihood of you having fatigue is actually higher, which makes total sense, right? Because if you're suffering from pain, you're probably also not sleeping well, and then you're probably also having fatigue, right? I realize I'm talking about one symptom, but we also know that these symptoms generally don't happen by themselves. Physical inactivity. So a lot of times if you start physical inactivity, that actually can perpetuate fatigue and actually cause deconditioning, which can make your fatigue worse. But the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral response to diagnosis and treatment can also impact cancer-related fatigue. And a lot of that has to do with, I would argue in this last one, the context with which you are managing your cancer journey, right? So if we know that if you have strong supports around you and you feel like you are that support system is helping you cope and manage with all the things that happened. Because one of the things about cancer, as we know, is it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not like your life stops when you get a cancer diagnosis. You are still managing kids, bills, trying to figure out how to pay for things. So the people that have that strong support system that helps navigate them through that actually have lower rates of fatigue. So this actually is from Facing Forward, Life After Cancer Treatment. If you guys have not gotten a copy of this and you are a cancer survivor, I would strongly recommend it. This is actually put out by the National Research Council, which is actually essentially part of or funded by the National Cancer Institute. This is a free booklet. It has a lot of great resources. They actually update this pretty regularly. I kept this particular quote, which was from the 006 book, because I thought it was really telling. And what Rosa says is, if I could stop feeling so tired all the time, I think I'd be fine. I've started getting used to everything else. So what this quote reminds me of is some of the work that I did before. I was working with a husband and wife. The husband had a diagnosis of cancer. I was meeting with them, and we were actually doing one-on-one, I would say, interviews, not about cancer-related symptoms. It was about something completely else. And we're talking, and as we're going through there, he mentions that he had had fatigue. And so I start talking to him about some of the different things, how to manage fatigue, all of these things, and talking about this term I don't actually really like, but, how you have to start to love where you are and figure out how to navigate that, and how it's not, a lot of people suffer from fatigue, all of these other things. And he actually, in the middle of the session, had to go to the restroom. So he gets up and he leaves, and his wife is there. She starts crying. And I'm like, oh my gosh, did I do something wrong, right? So I talked to her a little bit more about, I'm like, so tell me. And she explained, she's like, I thought he was lying. I didn't realize that fatigue was a real thing. She was getting ready to divorce him because she thought he just got lazy. And so, of course, I'm like, as a nurse, I realized, I had been talking about fatigue, right? I could tell you the numbers, but at that moment in time, I realized how much fatigue is impacting the families we are working with. Yet the vast majority of us aren't talking about it. So I can be honest, I don't know what happened with that family and that couple. I gave them a lot of resources. Hopefully that helped. But I know he left feeling like he had been heard for the first time in a long time, and that was really important. And I hope, she understood that cancer-related fatigue is definitely, because we cannot see it, it's kind of nebulous, right? And it's hard to tell other people, especially if you're 5 years out, right? Because many families think you should just get over it. Your treatment's done. You rang that bell. It's time to move on. And that's not quite as easy as it sounds for many of us. So what do you do if you have fatigue? Which is kind of like hopefully why many of you here, right? So the first thing I would recommend is to really look at any contributing factors for fatigue and see if those can be managed. So if you are having pain, it is important to manage your pain. And things like managing depression, anxiety, sleep disturbance. Part of my work actually is now around sleep, because about 30% of cancer survivors actually have issues with sleep. All of this post-treatment, right? So we have interventions around that. But if you're not sleeping well, then some of the fatigue management strategies I will talk to you later about may help, but not as well as if you can actually sleep. So definitely making sure to try to do all of those things. Nutrition, and I'm definitely not a nutritionist, but I think many of us know anecdotally that what we eat actually can change your physiology. So it is important to understand how nutrition impacts your overall health, and not just fatigue, but many of the things. Activity is important. And if you have anemia really does need to be addressed in whatever fashion that is in order to help you overcome things like fatigue. Because literally, if you cannot get oxygen to your tissues, you will always feel fatigued, right? And that's really part of the big issue with that. So what may help fatigue? So luckily for us, the American Society of Clinical Oncology and some really good colleagues of mine literally just published an update on how to manage cancer-related fatigue. And I can tell you it is light years better than the one they had 10 years ago, so I am super excited to share, because they actually have interventions to recommend, whereas before they had 2. Now we have a list of them, so I'm excited to go through these with you. So I'm going to tell you exercise. You've probably already heard this one. One of the things that I think is important is the types of exercise. So right now they're recommending aerobic, resistance, or a combination. Exercise should be tailored to the according to the individual's ability. I am so thankful they actually put this in. The previous recommendation was 150 minutes of exercise, which is literally the national recommendations for everybody, which is fine. But I can tell you, working with cancer survivors saying, hey, you should exercise 150 minutes. And I can tell you when I tell that to clinicians, I'm like, how many of you are exercising 150 minutes, right? Like almost none of us. So we're going to tell somebody who's severely fatigued to like, okay, go do some, aerobics 4 times a week. So this is really important. And one of the things that the tailored according to individual's ability, start where you are and build up is really what the recommendation is, right? So if that means you are walking outside for 5 minutes and that's as much as you can do, do it, right? And then just building up on that. One of the things that to be really cautious about when you start any exercise, if you do have fatigue, is that there can be a rebound fatigue if you over-exercise. So it really is important to start slow and build. The exercise that they're recommending could be supervised or unsupervised. Previously, there was a strong recommendation for supervised, meaning you should go to, if the Y had a some of the Ys used to have specific cancer survivor programs, things like that, which if you can do that, they are actually quite good, but it doesn't have to be. It really is whatever you can manage in your lifestyle is what we recommend at this point. Now, if you have issues with neuropathy, lymphedema, or your fatigue is so severe you don't know where to start, they recommend physical therapist. And I can't recommend physical therapy enough. Our physical therapists are phenomenal, especially if they've been trained specifically in oncology, and they will actually help design a plan to help you navigate all of these things safely. Because one of the things that I always worry about when we start recommending exercise with people who might have a different ability than they had before is they might get hurt. So the one thing we do not want is you getting hurt. So start where you are and build, and definitely get a physical therapist if you have that ability, and if you have any of these issues I just mentioned. So one of the things I want to talk about is the bottom of my slides. I agreed to have these available after, so you guys can actually get the slide deck. I have these this way. So what you can see here is the check mark. If it's green, means that's who this is recommended. The recommendation is for. So this is a recommendation for people who are in active treatment and for post-treatment. And I can tell you, pre-vivers, this actually is a recommendation for you. They just didn't have that in this guidelines. It is also a strong recommendation. So with that green word and strong means there have been multiple strong clinical trials, and quite honestly, in this instance, meta-analyses that support this recommendation. So this, we essentially know that exercise is good for fatigue. Now, with that, what types of exercise should you be thinking about? So start again where you are. Fast walking, and this doesn't mean you're a speed walker. It really could be anything that you feel your heart rate go up is fast walking. So for some of us, that's, probably slower or faster, depending on how your heart is conditioned. But it's important to get that heart rate a little bit up while you're trying to do some of this activity, even if it's for 3 minutes, 4 minutes, right? Do what you can. The next is bicycling. Now, I say this, if you have neuropathy in your feet, I actually do not recommend bicycling, but if you have the ability to bicycle, this actually is a really great way to get your heart rate up fast. I moved to Knoxville, and I thought, hey, I'm going to do, 2 things, because I wasn't getting enough exercise. I was like, I'm going to ride my bike to work. I did that once, and I barely made it up that hill to work. And then I was like, oh, this is ridiculous. So, do what you can, and please be reasonable. Hills are hard. Swimming is a phenomenal exercise. The other thing I would say is not just swimming, but those water aerobics at your local Y, I absolutely strongly recommend, especially if you have any sort of mobility issues. The water exercise can really help with some of that. They also recommend 2 to 3 strength training sessions per week once you've gotten your, I would say, endurance up for that. And strength training, what that really means for many of us is a lot of times we start out with weight bearing. It doesn't mean you have to be lifting weights, but it's that you are doing weight bearing activities. They can include things like weights, but it can also include things like bands. And they do recommend weightlifting. I will say I would only recommend weightlifting if you're being supervised, quite honestly, so you know how to use the weights. So these are some good options. The other thing I would add in here is anything that gets you physically active, I would count as exercise. And the one thing that when I'm working with people who are suffering from fatigue is we start out small, but you start out with something you actually enjoy doing. So if none of what I just said is anything you like to do, please don't go out and start doing it. I would recommend thinking of things you actually like to do that are physically active and incorporating that into what you do. So for many of the people that I work with, I start with, so what do you like to do? And if it's gardening, then do gardening, right? That can be physical work. The other thing is if it is walking or hiking, I even recommend that more. The more we are out in our natural environments, the actually better it is for you. So start where you are and do what you like, and really just start getting your body moving. So cognitive behavioral therapy is another one of their recommendations, and one of the things I will put a caveat for is it is cognitive behavioral therapy for fatigue. It is a specific thing. So if you are looking for a provider who does cognitive behavioral therapy, and this would be, there's a gamut of people who do cognitive behavioral therapy. That would be your psychologists, often your social workers are trained in cognitive behavioral therapy. Some nurses are, but not as many of us are trained in this. But you would specifically want somebody who knows cognitive behavioral therapy for fatigue, and there are actually some guidelines out there around what that actually includes. In this guideline, what they've said is it's cognitive behavioral therapy with or without hypnosis. I can tell you that the hypnosis piece I find really beneficial, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the work I've done in that space, but it doesn't have to be. The cognitive behavioral therapy is really about restructuring some of the different things, beliefs about fatigue, as well as helping people manage through this. So you can see here the basic pieces of cognitive behavioral therapy are actually in the little side here. Oh, there we go. So essentially, cognitive behavioral therapy posits that our thoughts, how we think about things, our emotions, how we feel about them, and our behavior are linked, and that impacts our physical health. I think for many of us, we've actually seen this play out over and over in our lives. And what cognitive behavioral therapy tries to do is to help our thoughts, our emotions, and our behavior to be in alignment with how we want to be in our physical health. So there's some specific guidelines to what is included in cognitive behavioral therapy, and specifically with cognitive behavioral therapy for fatigue. There's also, they're talking about fatigue. If you are suffering from any sleep issues, I would also strongly recommend cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. It actually is very effective. And again, you would want a provider who is trained in that. One of the areas that I do some work in is actually with the app-based cognitive behavioral therapy. And I can tell you that many of the sleep-based apps out there that are currently being marketed, they may say they have cognitive behavioral therapy in them, but they're often missing pieces of it, and I think that's important. So I would recommend you get a therapist who's actually trained in this before going to an app. These recommendations are really for people who are in active treatment or post-treatment, and the recommendations are strong. And I can tell you, in terms of the pre-Viber community, I would absolutely recommend cognitive behavioral therapy for fatigue if you are suffering from it. So this one's an easy one, right? Mindfulness. This makes a lot of sense for, I think, many of us who work in this space, because one of the things we know about mindfulness is that it actually can reduce that sort of flight or fight response we were talking about before. So just, and it's not just being present, right? So there's a lot of things around mindfulness that it's a little bit more than some of those pieces. Their recommendations are specifically either mindfulness-based stress reduction, and that actually is a specific intervention, and that is a structured 8-week intervention, and it involves generally weekly group sessions and daily meditation practices. And you can find trained providers in this. Many different organizations actually offer MBSR, and it doesn't have to be specific for fatigue, right? This is MBSR in general actually helps fatigue. The other would be mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So similar to what I just said about cognitive behavioral therapy, there's actually a part of cognitive behavioral therapy that includes mindfulness. So a practitioner trained in that could really help. And then mindful awareness practices. They're actually called MAPS. These are specific interventions, and that you can actually look up. That one is more of a newer to me, and I think there's a couple of groups across the country that are actually implementing that. One of the things that their recommendation specifically said is that you could receive these interventions either in person or they've seen success with web-based programs. So, and these recommendations are for both active treatment, post-treatment. They are strong, meaning there's a lot of research around this. And I can tell you that these mindfulness-based interventions would be very helpful for the pre-Viper community as well. So similar to the mindfulness, they also are recommending Tai Chi for the first time, which I am absolutely thrilled about. Tai Chi, if you don't know, is an ancient martial art in China. And it has become more focused on health and promotion over, I think, the last decade or so. But what you want, Tai Chi is a low to moderate intensity activity. I would also count this as an exercise, so, win-win there. But it's a series of slow, gentle movements. There's postures involved. There's meditative state of mind and controlled breathing. All of those things combined, there's some belief around the chi and how it flows and how having that flow actually can help with fatigue overall. I have a couple of colleagues who've done work in this space with some really nice outcomes. Specifically, this recommendation is for those who are in active treatment, and that recommendation is strong. The question mark in post-treatment is because there's not enough evidence. Doesn't mean it doesn't help. What it means is there wasn't enough evidence to have it be a recommendation at this time. I can tell you, how many of you have actually done Tai Chi before? It is fantastic. I really enjoy the practice, and I think it combines some of the things that we see with the meditative practices, right? It really can help bring you into that relaxation state, which is so important for our overall health. The next, very similar, is Qigong. And how many of you have practiced Qigong? Yeah. So Qigong actually is similar but different to Tai Chi. It also is considered low to moderate intensity. It uses exercises to optimize the energy within the body, the mind, the spirit. It has some similar practices to Tai Chi, but it is definitely a different thing. And it has both the psychological and physical components that really is about regulation of the mind, the breath, and the movements and posture. Qigong actually, in some instances, well, not in some, it started out as a spiritual practice, right? Similar to Tai Chi, similar to yoga. It has moved into, with the work we've seen now, a physical health space, but it still is tying back to that spiritual practice in a lot of ways, which is that energy movement. The recommendations here for active treatment survivors, right now the post-treatment survivor work, there's only been a couple of very small studies, but I think it's starting to build. And that evidence for active treatment recommendation is actually very strong. Oh, and I should say, some of the definitions that I'm sharing with you are actually from the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. So that is an organization that is funded by the National Institute of Health. So if you ever have any questions around complementary or integrative health, that's their whole job, is to communicate out and do research in this space, but they have some really nice definitions and resources. I have this all at the end of the slide deck to refer people back to as well. So psychoeducation, and I'm like, oh, I really don't enjoy that term, but that is kind of the official. And psychoeducation really means that we are doing education not just for knowledge, but also to try to motivate and change behavior. That's kind of the psychoeducation piece. And what we've seen with cancer-related fatigue is that it improves understanding of the fatigue mechanisms, coping strategies, and overall quality of life. So technically, you guys are getting a little piece of psychoeducation today, right? But not necessarily that, motivation part. Oh, well, maybe. We'll see at the end. So essentially, it enables self-care behaviors that are designed to minimize fatigue. So this recommendation is really, I would say, well, they said this too, but for active treatment survivors. But the recommendation is conditional or weak. And when you see this little orange check mark and it says conditional or weak, that means there was probably one randomized control trial that saw benefit, not multiples. So there's definitely more work being done in this space. That being said, psychoeducation, the risk of that is very low. So it's a very low-risk intervention. We have seen psychoeducation work in a lot of different aspects for different symptoms to be helpful, and it's really about getting people the tools to help self-manage, right? So hopefully we'll see some more work in this, and also a little bit better delivery. The one that they based this on was an in-person delivery, and I think there's a lot of opportunities to open that up a little. So yoga. How many of you have done yoga? How many of you do yoga regularly? Excellent. Also counts as exercise in my book. But yoga really emphasizes that physical postures, the breathing techniques, and the meditation. So hopefully if you have a good yoga therapist, right, as you're moving through your different yoga poses, you're also talking about your breath. I cannot tell you enough how much the way we breathe can impact your physiology. So meaning you can literally change things like the amount of cortisol in your body by changing your breath. It's really cool. Just fascinating, the human body. This recommendation for active treatment, there actually wasn't enough evidence to have a recommendation for this. For post-treatment cancer survivors, it's conditional or weak. So I can tell you there's actually been a lot of what we would call preliminary studies in this space, and only one big yoga study we would consider would be the strong evidence, which is why it's conditional or weak. I can tell you since Julie Bauer, who is the author of this particular guideline, yoga is one of her key interventions. I know she's doing a lot more work in this space, so I have a feeling as we get the next, hopefully, round of recommendations, these will be stronger. So acupressure. How many of you have heard of acupressure before? Any of you do it? Yeah, so acupressure's been around for a really long time, along with acupuncture. Right now I'm just going to talk about acupressure. But for those of you, it actually works under the same essential theories around acupuncture, which is the meridians in the body and how our chi flows and the pressure applied to those acupuncture points. But what we do instead is you literally apply pressure instead of using a needle. This particular research was not done in active treatment survivors. It was done in post-treatment survivors, and it's conditional or weak because there was only one big study. There actually is an app that is freely available from the University of Michigan about acupressure and cancer-related fatigue. So our colleague Susie Zick actually tested this, and as far as I know, it is still freely available. They saw some really excellent findings, meaning significantly improved cancer-related fatigue by large amounts. So this has been really good. And the one that I'm showing you here is just the one I could find a picture of. Those aren't the actual pressure points for fatigue, so just to clarify that. But what we can see here is that there's, I think, a lot of opportunities for this. So let's see here. Moxibustion. I had some fun conversations about this last night. Have you guys ever used this? Yeah, so what's interesting about moxibustion, and so I'm a proponent for acupuncture. We'll talk a little bit later about that later, but often moxibustion is actually used in conjunction with acupuncture. The top picture here is actually the traditional use of moxibustion, which essentially it involves plant-based material, often an herb that's lit. That heat is actually put on top of an acupuncture point, and that's part of how it's supposed to, so it's in line with the different traditional Chinese medicine theories around how acupuncture works. What was really fascinating to me when I was reading this is they are using infrared lasers to deliver this, which just like, I was like, oh, that's weird. So I read the studies, and they're not using any plant material at all. So what they are doing is literally using the lasers to apply heat to those acupuncture points, and they're finding success in that. So that, I think, is really fascinating. That work was done in post-treatment cancer survivors, and it really is only one big study that did that. The bottom slide here is not necessarily the laser that they use, but one of those lasers that applied heat. What I did not know is that there's a whole bunch of these lasers available. Free, like I Googled it because I had never seen these before, and there are like 15 different moxibustion lasers. I was like, wow. I would recommend strongly that you go to somebody who is trained in this for so many reasons. One of them, anytime you use a laser, there's always risk. That being said, their findings were actually really, I think, good and promising. Now, next, I already gave you the disclosure about American ginseng. This is actually the work of my mentor, Dr. Deb Barton. So American ginseng, which is a specific type of ginseng, her work found that 2,000 milligrams daily of American ginseng, which comes in a capsule, significantly improved cancer-related fatigue for cancer survivors during active treatment. The reason why that's conditional or weak is there was one very large randomized control trial for this. That trial actually did enroll post-treatment cancer survivors, and they did a sub-analysis for survivors, and they did not find any difference. But I'm going to tell you why we think that is, because when we did the sub-analysis, we realized this was a national study, so they were recruiting from all over the United States. What happened is that the term survivor, many of the patients who were put on as a post-treatment cancer survivor had literally just completed treatment, meaning that many of the people who were on that control group had a natural recovery in fatigue in that time right after treatment, and we believe that skewed the results. That being said, I'm getting ready to do the post-treatment trial in American ginseng to see if it really can help or not. What I like to talk about with ginseng, which it's specific, and I can't tell you enough how much I mean this about any of the herbs or supplements that you take. It is very important to know where they come from. I do a lot of work around this, especially working with patients and caregivers around supplements and that are taken, because American ginseng grown outside of the United States is being marketed, but it matters where that plant is grown because it actually changes the chemical properties of that plant. So we really only recommend Wisconsin American ginseng. That is not what the ASCO guidelines say, but I can tell you that's what they're based on. And that it makes a difference, right? So one of the things that plants do, as many of us know, is they suck up the soil around them. And with that, you can end up with heavy metals or not, things like that. The Wisconsin American ginseng growers have been, the entire time they've been producing, using a third-party lab to ensure that what's in there is actually what they say it is, and that the crop that they're doing the production on has a minimum amount of what we call ginsenosides, which is the active ingredient. If it goes lower than 5%, then the results for many of the things that we use ginseng for aren't good. Right? You need to have a minimum amount. The reason why I clarify that, there are a lot of ginsengs out there, a lot of them. If you go onto Amazon right now and you put in ginseng, you will get a bajillion different options. I recommend that you get the one branded by the Wisconsin ginseng growers, and it is not because they give me free samples, because they don't, I would love that, but it's because of the way in which they secure that product. Now, what I keep up to date on this, and I found that they're now growing American ginseng in China, which has a different soil content. So I don't know if it would have the same results as these. That's really why I would say that. But I say that about all supplements you take. It's important to know where they come from. So coping with fatigue. And I can tell you that this is, I think, a really important topic. Because one of the things, so I gave you some different interventions, but how do you manage day to day? And I can tell you, my dad had stage 4 lung cancer, and I can tell you cancer-related fatigue was actually his number one complaint. And it was so impactful in his life that we did a lot of different things. And I can tell you we did a lot of things I just mentioned. Specifically, he was on American ginseng. But I think what was even more important, besides those interventions, was figuring out how to help him navigate that. Planning for your day, and I think this is really important, and it's funny because the text is so small here, I'm like blind, but being active at the time of day when that's most alert and energetic. And I think this is actually really important, because one of the things that when working with my dad and actually other cancer survivors, as I've done this for the last 15, 20 years, is thinking about what's important to you. If you are truly suffering from fatigue and it's impacting your life, figure out what is your priority and make sure that's the thing that gets done. And it gets done at your most optimal time. And I think we should probably all do that, right? But I think specifically, if you're not sure you're going to be able to get to anything else, make sure you get to what you prioritize. Because our daily lives are an influx of all these things. We make choices about what we're going to do. Being cognizant and prioritizing the things you want to do is very important. And giving yourself I would say, the ability to do that, right? It's okay to manage your time wisely. And I think especially for many of us who have so many competing priorities, that it's important for us to hear that your priorities are important and need to get done, whatever that could be. And save your energy by changing how you do things. And I think for my dad and I, this was actually an important piece. He was a very independent man, and that was really important to him and to his overall well-being. So things like he did not want somebody else coming into his house to clean or to do dishes. So what we did instead was change how those things got done. And I mean things like he used a stool to sit at so he could do his dishes. He agreed to buy a Roomba, right? So just thinking about how these things get done, maybe that needs to change. And then also honoring the fact that it is okay to hire out things that aren't as important to you. Like, if you are okay with having somebody come in and clean your house, please do that, right? Like, that is absolutely okay. The other is to take short naps or breaks. We really only recommend this if you are essentially at a place where taking a nap actually makes you feel better. And what I mean by that is if you take a nap and you are still groggy, please do not take a nap. What I would prefer you do is try to sleep better or longer. The other is do what you enjoy and make that an absolute priority. Let others help you and choose how you spend your energy. If it's finite, make sure that you're spending it in things that really matter to you. And think about joining support groups. It sounds like many of you are probably already part of many of the forced support groups. I strongly recommend that. Many of the people who've gone through what you are in your journey have some great recommendations too. And not to end us on a negative note, but I want to make sure it's clear what is not recommended. This is again from the ASCO guidelines. And I've seen many people try to use these over the years, but things like wakefulness agents like modafinil or armodafinil, I think many prescribers are trying to be helpful, but what this really does for most cancer survivors specifically is it makes them feel anxious and alert, but still fatigued. Meaning if you've ever drank too much coffee and you're like, I'm kind of nauseous, I can't close my eyes, but I'm still really tired, that's how many of the survivors feel when they're taking these meds. And the same thing with the psychostimulants, like the methylphenidate. So it is not recommended for essentially anybody who is a cancer survivor, so either active or post-treatment, and that recommendation is very strong. Now, there have been some other supplements that have been tested. L-carnitine is one of the ones that was tested quite a bit, and that is not recommended. They actually had somebody in the initial study who actually died during that treatment trial, and they're not sure if it was because of the way the L-carnitine interacted with their cancer treatment at the time. Antidepressants such as paroxetine, they actually haven't been shown to actually help improve cancer-related fatigue. Now, for many people, there are low-dose antidepressants are actually used in cancer survivors successfully for things like hot flashes, or for I would say some of treat depression, of course, but there's some other symptoms that low-dose antidepressants have actually been successful with. However, it has not shown to change fatigue at all. And right now, there's insufficient evidence, which means we don't know one way or the other, for things like acupuncture. And I can tell you, I'm actually a proponent of acupuncture. I think if you've been part of, if that is somewhere in your scope of acceptability, I would absolutely recommend it. It has been shown to significantly reduce things like pain, but I've definitely seen it anecdotally help people with fatigue as well. We don't have enough information for things like coenzyme Q10. I know there's being work right now around that, so we'll know more hopefully in the next couple of years. Guarana, which I don't know if you've heard that before, but it is actually its main ingredient is caffeine. So there was one large study a while ago that used it, but it looked as if the results were similar to those that were using like modafinil, right? That it wasn't really helping the fatigue, but they were feeling a little bit more alert and anxious. So I'm not necessarily a proponent of that. There's a thing called brainwave vibration meditation. So what I love about some of these guidelines, I'm like, oh, what's that? So I would look this up. So that, intriguing. I think there's some preliminary evidence coming out. Minocycline, which is a pharmaceutical, music or music therapy. Now, I can tell you there's a lot of evidence for music and music therapy around pain management. It's just starting to come out with fatigue. I absolutely recommend it because we already know that music can also, very similar to changing your breathing, can help with that stress reduction. Progressive muscle relaxation, reflexology, and solution-focused therapy, which I need to look up more about, but if I understand it correctly, it is similar to cognitive behavioral therapy, but is actually more of an action planning. So those are things we're still working on, but are definitely up and coming. So some of the things that I've done in terms of specifically looking at fatigue, besides the ginseng stuff that we've already talked about, is looking at interventions around what's called attention restorative therapy. And really what that is nature exposure. So this is based on work that, I will say, Kaplan did this work, I think, in the late 70s, early 80s, around how being in nature can actually change some of the different things around attention. He wasn't thinking cancer survivors. I had a colleague at the University of Michigan who actually did a lot of work around having women with breast cancer go out into nature and do hikes, and she saw some improvements specifically with that cognitive fatigue that happens. I've moved that a little bit into hypnotherapy and also virtual reality. So that the attention restorative therapy, hypnotherapy is promising. We are working on that. And I can tell you right now that it's promising, but it's not necessarily evidence-based at this point. But the virtual reality, I actually did an intervention with breast cancer survivors, really taking that idea of nature exposure. One of the reasons why we think that attention restorative theory or therapy works, so that nature exposure, is that sense of awe we get when we're in nature, so that fascination, and it actually helps to rewire brain, right? That neuroactivity changes when you actually are in that sort of awe, fascination state. So we did virtual reality, where people could choose from 9 different nature I would say, experiences. We used branded, so Nature Trek. So I didn't make these, right? We had actual people who knew what they were doing with VR make these. And the survivors did this for 6 weeks. We saw large improvements of that cognitive fatigue, so significantly improved over those 6 weeks. We are working on this further to develop this intervention and actually make sure it is truly effective, because we had a small study that showed good results, so we need to see that in a larger study. So if you are interested, let me know, because this hopefully will be funded in the next year or so. But one of the cool things that I will say for this, what it told me though, is if it needs to be an environment that was really relaxing. The majority of the women, so there were 9 environments, so I always also like, which environment seems to be, there's one of these where you're actually in the ocean, and you don't have to move, right? Like, you can explore these environments, but you didn't have to. And if you stayed in one place long enough, you would actually see whales come by. So what I think was happening, it was a whole bunch of different things. So you had that sort of awe experience happening virtually, but it was also really meditative, right? So they were getting into this really deep relaxation state. And we did some qualitative, right, talking to the women about this, and they expressed that, it was so relaxing. Now, part of me left those interviews thinking 2 things. I think nature is fantastic, however we get it. But I was wondering, I'm like, well, is it because we gave women 20 minutes to themselves? And is that an intervention in itself, right? Like, should I test that? Like, is that my control for the next? So anyway, because one of the things I heard over and over is that it was so great to have 20 minutes to myself. So things to think about. And I think, that's everything on that one. So we are working on continuing to, these are very preliminary what I'm sharing with you. So we're continuing to work and develop these. One of the other things, and this is not related to fatigue-ish, is we are actually part of our group, so the CASI team, we do a lot of work in sexual health. Now, and I mentioned this a little bit before, but sexual health, cancer-related fatigue, hot flashes, they actually are all sort of correlated. If you are having chronic hot flashes, the likelihood you have fatigue is actually pretty high. If you are having chronic hot flashes, you're probably also having some issues around sexual health. We know these things. And the same thing with fatigue kind of crosses over into all of those. And I'm doing a little bit more work around how cancer-related fatigue actually is related to sexual desire, specifically in women. Because if you are fatigued, the likelihood that you're going to be have that sexual desire to actually have sex is pretty low. And I say that's a theory, that we actually don't have proof for that, but I think most of us have that as a lived experience. What I would say, so part of our work is around sexual health because it actually is, I think, a huge issue for many women, but also because of its relationship with these other things. I have this up here. We are actually currently recruiting for a psychosexual, see, I said I didn't like the term, but yet we use it here, Psychosexual Educational Partners Program. It's the PEP study. And we are doing, this is really doing psychosexual education with women and their partners. And what we've done in this particular study is we've worked with two collaborators who are psychologists, one of whom is actually at Fox Chase, and the other is actually at the Sloan Kettering. And what we've done is we've taken their clinical practice, their research practice, and we've put it into a self-management workbook. And the reason why we did that is because we were having a very hard time getting women's partners to agree to do these interventions. So we've made them self-management, and we've increased our ability to have women's partners as part of these studies. And overwhelmingly, the women that were in our initial very small study were so thankful that they were able to do this with their partners with a physical workbook. So we are now testing that again in a larger group. If you are interested in this at all, please reach out to me. That QR code with the little dinosaur in there should take you to our website. But I'm always happy to answer any questions. And then that actually concludes the slide presentation of this, and now I'm open for questions.
If you have any questions, you can go ahead and walk up to the microphone and ask.
Absolutely. I can repeat what you say. Yeah. So the answer to that is they actually are very effective for anxiety and depression. They aren't necessarily very helpful for fatigue. So oftentimes people who have depression, we recommend that they do take or start taking antidepressants if they haven't, and then we'll treat the fatigue separately. So does that make sense? Yes. Correct. But I will honor that some people have depression that can get resolved with taking antidepressants. But that's not necessarily cancer-related fatigue. That's essentially just to sort of piece those pieces out. So if you have cancer-related fatigue, treating depression generally doesn't solve the fatigue itself. Does that make sense? Okay. Other questions? We're a small but mighty group here. Oh, good. So that's a really great clarifying question. Yeah, so the question was about the sort of the other causes of fatigue, so not necessarily cancer related. I listed that there was drug and alcohol. Generally, in that bullet, I was meaning street drugs. So we know that, or any sort of, at this point, I would even put CBD in there because we actually do know that CBD or marijuana also can be directly related to fatigue. It's legal in some states and not some others, so I'd still put that in there. There are many of the street drugs that actually we know can cause long-term issues with fatigue. And the same thing with long-term alcohol use. Now, what that means is if you're drinking a glass of wine once a week, that is probably not your issue with fatigue, right? We really mean more the people that are using it either daily, multiple times a day. That's where we see the higher rates of fatigue. And the same thing I would say even with the street drugs, right? The casual user is generally not the person who has an issue with fatigue. Yes, ma'am.
The recommendations that you listed for helping with fatigue,
Mm-hmm.
do you see that some help more than others?
So that question was, were there some of the recommendations that some help more than others? And the answer to that is, so I can tell you anecdotally, yes. But with what we have for the evidence, right now, those recommendations are essentially recommended at the same level unless they were listed as conditionally. When I have worked with patients who have had fatigue for a long time, what I find most helpful are those things that they can incorporate first. So whatever that can be. The other thing I would say is that while these are kind of blanket recommendations, we also have to be very considerate or conscious of who were in these studies. And a lot of times, many of these studies have a very narrow population. So thinking about that. The other thing I would put out there is that not all of these interventions are going to work for everybody. So you have to find the intervention that resonates most with you and that you think you can incorporate, that you find the most benefit from. Most of the people that I work with, I actually start them, quite honestly, with yoga, because I think that's a great practice to start with. A lot of people can incorporate, and it can be adapted physically very easily. But I think that might change depending on who it is I'm working with.